Now we're going to consider the gains from international trade between people in different countries. And we're going to focus mainly in this lesson on what's called comparative advantage of a reason to gain from international trade. There are, of course, many ways to gain from trade, and we considered them throughout the course in economics. One is just simple voluntary exchange. A person who had two hats, another person two pairs of sunglasses could gain from trading one hat for the sunglasses, and the person would have a hat and sunglasses and a hat and sunglasses, and they'd be better off. It was a gain from trade. We've also noted how if there's a number of firms in an industry trading with themselves and with customers, there's more competition compared to there's only one firm, a monopoly. In that case, the prices are lower and there's more variety of goods. That's a gain from this competition. We're going to focus on two other gains from trade that are frequently mentioned in international discussions. One's the comparative advantage, this is today, and larger markets, which will be the next lesson. You might ask at the beginning, well, since you've talked about trade already, voluntary exchange and things like that, why do we need a special section on international trade? What's so different about international trade? Well, the main difference is when there's trade across borders between one country and another, there's the possibility that trade may be restricted, unlike the restriction that might occur if you're trading with friends and people in your own neighborhood. So international trade, therefore, has traditionally been a special topic in economics because of the borders between countries, which frequently restrict the goods and services that can cross or the people that can cross through migration. So international trade, therefore, has a special aspect and a special role in economic analysis. Let's begin with some definitions that focus on this idea of comparative advantage. One is, to begin with, is simply what's called absolute advantage. And that's a case where a country can produce a good more efficiently than another country. It occurs a lot of times, occurs all the time. U.S. could be better at producing oranges than Canada, especially if you think of Florida or Southern California, where the climate is just right for oranges, and there's no similar areas in Canada. May be able to grow a few oranges, but not as productively in Canada as in the United States. So the U.S. has what's called an absolute advantage in oranges. Might also say the U.S. has an absolute advantage in producing lumber. There's lots of beautiful forests in Canada, a lot of beautiful forests in the United States, but it may be that because of the weather being generally nicer in the U.S., not as much snow, it's actually more efficient to produce lumber in the United States than in Canada. If that were the case, then the United States would also have an absolute advantage in producing lumber compared to Canada. Comparative advantage is a different concept. It's really comparing not only the relative efficiency of producing two goods, it's comparing the relative efficiency in two different countries. More precisely, we say a country can produce a good relatively more efficiently than another good in comparison with another country. In that case, that country has a comparative advantage in producing that good. Examples will help a lot. Suppose there's two countries, again, Canada and the United States. Canada can have a comparative advantage in a good in which the United States has an absolute advantage. We just gave an example where we argued that the United States has an absolute advantage in producing lumber. But it very well might be that Canada has a comparative advantage in producing lumber compared to producing oranges relative to the United States. Virtually impossible to produce many oranges in Canada. So the United States is relatively more efficient in producing oranges than Canada. And while the United States may have an absolute advantage in lumber, Canada is likely to have a comparative advantage, at least compared to growing oranges relative to the United States. If so, we'll argue that Canada should specialize in producing lumber. Maybe consider just an example of people, get the basic idea of comparative advantage. One example I like to use is a lawyer and an economist. I'm an economist. Turns out my wife is a lawyer. I argue that she's a better economist than I am, and she's obviously a much better lawyer than I am. I didn't even go to law school. So what we've decided is that in the family, she'll be the lawyer and I'm the economist, because even though she's better at being a lawyer and better at being an economist than I am, she's relatively better at being a lawyer, and I'm relatively better at being an economist. So this kind of thing happens all the time in everyday life, and all we need to do is to try to think about how we apply that to different countries, not just different people. So to get started on, let's think of a simple example, numerical example, which represents how much is produced per day of work in two different countries. So we'll consider the United States and Korea. And we'll consider two goods. Pharmaceutical production could be a vaccine, and some electronics production could be TV sets. In this particular case, we're assuming that in the United States, 1 day of work produces 6 units of vaccine and 3 TV sets. In Canada, 1 day of work is assumed to produce 1 unit of vaccine and 2 TV sets. So you can see right away that the U.S. has an absolute advantage in producing vaccines and also an absolute advantage in producing TV sets. It's more productive than in both. But let's consider which country has the comparative advantage in which good. How do we find out who has a comparative advantage in each good? Well, we need to consider that table carefully. Again, remember the U.S. has an absolute advantage over Korea in both vaccine and TV sets, simply because 6 is greater than 1 and 3 is greater than 2 in that table. We say the U.S. has a comparative advantage, however, in producing vaccines, these pharmaceutical goods, because 6 over 1 is greater than 3 over 2. The capability of the United States in producing pharmaceuticals is 6 times greater than Korea. It's only 50% or 3 over 2 times that Korea can do in the case of TV sets. A country cannot have a comparative advantage in both goods, so by definition, once you understand that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in vaccines, it must be the case that Korea has a comparative advantage in TV sets. And indeed, that's the case, because 2/3, that's the relative efficiency of TV sets, Canada compared to the United States, is much greater than 1 over 6, the relative efficiency of vaccines in Canada compared to the United States. So Korea has a comparative advantage in producing TV sets. So now let's go to think about the advantages that might occur in terms of improving the gains from trade in this circumstance. So we can think about 2 people or 2 countries gaining from trade, as I've indicated with the example of my wife. But in terms of countries, let's do this numerical example. Let's assume to start that the price of a unit of vaccine for a TV set is 1 to 1. So it may be that the unit of vaccine is $100 and the TV set is $100. They have the same price, so you can exchange a unit of vaccine for a TV set. It's 1 to 1. Then how can the U.S. gain from trade in this particular case? Well, for example, the U.S. could reduce TV production by 3 units by moving some workers out of TV production and move those workers into vaccine production. With the numerical example, that would mean it could increase vaccine production by 6 units. Now, with the 6 units of vaccine, U.S. can go to Korea and trade for 6 TV sets. At the end, it has 6 TV sets, which is 3 more than it had if it was producing the TV sets by itself. So in other words, by producing fewer TV sets and more vaccines using its production possibilities, it's actually able to consume more TV sets and the same amount of vaccines as it did before. So this is a gain from trade. Now you might think if the U.S. is gaining from trade, then obviously Korea can't be. Is Korea being exploited by this comparative advantage? By no means. Let's consider Korea, because Korea can also gain from trade. Let's see how it does it. Suppose Korea increases TV production by 6 by moving workers out of the vaccine production into TV production. It's reducing its vaccine production by 3 units when it does this. But now it can take its 6 TV sets and trade with the U.S. and get 6 vials or units of vaccine. So Korea comes out ahead. It has 3 more units, 3 more vials of vaccine than it did at the start, and the same number of TVs as before. So this is a benefit of trade that comes to Korea as well. Now, when you think about this example, I said that the price of TVs and pharmaceutical goods like vaccine was 1 to 1 after trade. Where does that 1 come from? Well, we want to consider where that comes from. So first consider what the price ratio would be without trade, based on the production possibilities that I indicated. In the United States, those possibilities say that its 6 vials cost the same to produce as 3 TVs. That's a day's work. So that would suggest that TV should cost twice as much of vials as vials as a vaccine. That means the price ratio of TV to vaccines would be 2. It might be that a TV costs $100 and the vaccine costs $50. The ratio would be 2 in this case. Of course, the price of TV is more expensive than vaccines in the U.S. without trade because it takes so much more labor time to produce. In Korea, it works the other way. In Korea, 2 TVs cost the same to produce as 1 vial of the vaccine. So TV should cost half as much as the vials, and indeed the ratio of the price of a TV to the price of vaccine would be 1/2 in this case. So without trade, the price ratio is different in the United States than in Korea. But what we know from basic economics is when trade takes place, the prices will move together. Prices will move together because people will go to where it's cheapest to buy the good. And so we would suspect, therefore, that the price ratio of TVs to vaccines would move together after trade. And they would move together somewhere between the 2 ratios without trade. The 2 ratios without trade are 2 and 1/2. So with trade, the price ratio would be somewhere in between. 1 is in between 2 and 1/2. So our choice of 1, therefore, is consistent with this argument. 1, of course, is a nice number. It's easy to multiply by 1, and that's why we chose it. We could have chosen 1.1, we could have chosen 1.5, we could have chosen 0.8. Those all would be between 2 and 1/2. And indeed, depending on people's demand in Korea and the United States for TV and vaccine, the price ratio might wind up anywhere between 1/2 and 2. The choice of 1 makes it easy, for an example. Now, what we'd like to do, using that number 1 again, is to illustrate the gains from trade using production possibilities curve. And I want to think about that using the price ratio of 1 as I have argued it should be. So let's draw a picture. And in this picture, let's be sure that we remember what the production possibilities are. So up in this section of the screen, I'll write something for the United States and something for Korea in the rows. And I'll make a little table here. And up here, I'm going to put in the vaccines and TVs. And just remember that in the U.S., a day's work gives you 6 vaccines. In Korea, a day's work gives you 1 vaccine. In the U.S., a day's work gives you 3 TVs, and the number is 2 in the case of Korea. And to get the production possibilities, let's assume that in the U.S., we have 10,000 workers that could be either producing the vaccines or the TVs. And let's assume in Korea that we have 30,000 workers that could be producing either vaccines or TVs. Now, with this information, we can draw a production possibility curve for the 2 countries. And let's draw them side by side. So we'll have 1 diagram here and 1 diagram here. And in this diagram, we're going to have vaccines on the vertical axis and TVs on the horizontal axis. Same with this diagram. And let's let this diagram on the left be US and this one on the right be Korea. So we have 2 production possibilities curves, 1 for United States and 1 for Korea. Now, with the information about the number of workers in the production table, we can determine what the production possibilities curves are. So, for example, in the U.S., you have 10,000 workers. If they were all producing vaccines, you have 60,000 units of vaccine. And so let's make sure that our axis goes up as high as 60,000. So that looks like about 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, if these are in thousands, which we'll assume that they are. And then on this axis, we'll have a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 as well. As we'll see, that will be the scale needed on the horizontal axis. And then we'll do the same thing in Korea, just sketching out the 10, the 20, the 30, 40, 50, and 60, and the first unit is a 10. Same on the horizontal axis, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60. Okay, now let's draw the curves. As I mentioned, if in the U.S. all 10,000 workers are producing vaccines, we get 60,000. That's the maximum that we can produce. If all those 10,000 workers are producing TVs, we get 3 times 10,000 or 30,000. So those are 2 points on the production possibilities curve. And indeed, as we move workers out of vaccine production into TV production in the US, we move down along that production possibilities curve. Note that it's a straight line rather than a bowed out curve. That's the nature of this simple example. We can do the same thing in Korea as well. Suppose all the 30,000 workers in Korea are producing vaccines. In that case, we get 30,000 vaccines, 1 per each worker. And if they all go into producing TVs, the 30,000 workers will produce 2 each, in which case we'll get 60,000 in that case. So we go over to 60, and that's the production possibilities curve for Korea. So they're different, and that's what the curves would look like if they were unable to trade. But now let's consider the possibility of trade. And using the curves, let's just suppose that the U.S. specializes in producing vaccines. Okay, so it's going to be up at that point producing 60,000 vaccines. But now if it can trade, and it also can trade at a 1-to-1 ratio, it can trade, and I'll move along this line here, it can trade those vaccines it's producing for TVs all along that line. That's supposed to be a straight line. And so it's possible now through trade to get out there, to actually be consuming more TVs and more vaccines than the production possibility curve in the first place would suggest. The same thing can be true in Korea. Suppose Korea specializes completely in producing TVs, then it would produce 60,000 TVs, but now it could go and trade those with the United States 1 for 1 and get as many as 60,000 units of vaccines, or any place in between. So it's really effectively moved out its production possibilities curve through trade. It's shifted it out. Its consumption possibilities, if you like to think of it that way, are greater than its production possibilities. It's almost like a new technology has been invented. It's not a new technology, it's just trade, but the new technology could suggest you could produce more of both goods if you wanted to with the new technology. Here there's new technology, but the trade generates the same thing. So my diagram's a little hard to read, the squiggly lines. Let's look at a nice smooth diagram, which is right here, just a replica of what I've just did, all the same assumptions. So in this case, you have the production possibility curve for the US over on the left, drawn in blue. You have a production possibility curve for Korea over on the right, drawn in blue. We could assume we start off at point A in the United States, at point D in Korea. And now you can think about the argument I made about specializing in pharmaceutical production in the US up at point B, and then being able to take the same kind of argument with respect to Korea, producing at point E. That would be a specialization in the TV production, and then do the trade between the two. And there's the trade for the United States and the possibilities that that creates, and there's the trade for Korea and the possibilities that that creates for Korea. You can also kind of look carefully to convince yourself that this is a real gain. So look over on the left. You can assume that at point A there were 15,000 TVs consumed in the United States and 30,000 units of vaccine consumed in the United States without trade. Now with trade, you can move to point C. If you wanted to, in the United States, you could consume now twice as many TV sets, 30,000, and no fewer vaccines. That's what the trade enabled you to do. Of course, you don't have to be at point C. You could be at any point on that line. Korea is sort of the same story. You could see Korea could be at point F, and this point F, it's consuming more TVs and more vaccines, so unequivocally it's benefiting from trade. Both countries are benefiting from trade. No country is exploiting the other country. So that's how comparative advantage works. It's an impressive finding, an impressive idea, an impressive theory, and it seems to work in many respects in explaining what the gains from trade are. The main conclusions of this comparative advantage model are that countries should specialize in the goods for which they have a comparative advantage. Most likely they will tend to specialize if trade between the countries is permitted in one way or another. We've illustrated this in the case of a straight line production possibilities curve, constant opportunity costs of one good versus another to make it simple. And that's the reason there's complete specialization. In this case, Korea specializing completely in producing TVs and the US in the pharmaceutical goods. And that's the nature of this simple example that we've worked with. If the production possibilities curves were bowed out, as we saw earlier in the course, then specialization would not be complete. It would settle a little bit short of complete specialization, probably still some pharmaceutical goods made in Korea and some TVs made in the United States, but the story would be essentially the same, the story of the gains from trade due to comparative advantage. What determines the comparative advantage for a given country? Well, we gave examples of the weather, the United States being more suitable for growing oranges and Canada more suitable for growing lumber, giving the comparative advantage in lumber for Canada and oranges in the United States. But there's also changes that can be endogenous, if you like. Policy can make the changes. For example, there could be a change in how much capital or how much skills there are in the United States versus Canada. Canada might decide that it should invest heavily in lumber production, or maybe even in orange production, or maybe yet in some other thing, and develop a comparative advantage in that good. And the U.S. could focus more on education to improve the skills of workers, to develop some wholly new good for which it has a comparative advantage. And indeed, comparative advantage changes over time. Not that long ago, the U.S. did have a comparative advantage in producing TV sets compared to Korea. But Korea, through various more education and more investment, developed a comparative advantage. U.S. has a comparative advantage in pharmaceuticals now, but it very well changed. It may be changing as we speak to a comparative advantage in programs for the internet. And Korea may be developing a comparative advantage in other areas. So the world is always changing, always changing comparative advantage. But once at a given point in time, one can determine a comparative advantage in these examples. You can demonstrate there'll be a gain from trade. And indeed, the gain from trade may be different and changing over time. But nonetheless, this comparative advantage model shows you the size and how to compute the gains from trade at any particular point in time for any particular group of countries. Thank you.